Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to all of you tuning in from around the world. I hope you're all staying safe and healthy. My name is Luke, and welcome to what I'm sure is going to be an incredibly interesting How To Academy event. Today, we are very lucky to have with us Professor David Nutt, the Edmond J Safra Chair in Neuropsychopharmacology at Imperial College London and Director of the Neuropsychopharmacology Unit in the Division of Brain Sciences there. He is the chairman and founder of Drug Science, a non-profit which does independent evidence-based research into drugs and their effects, and his book, Drink, The New Science of Alcohol and Your Health, is out now. David will be joined in conversation today by Will Self, award-winning author and professor of contemporary thought at Brunel University. Will has written openly about his history with drug use, most notably in his recent memoir, simply entitled Will, which is also out now. After a 45-minute conversation, Will and David will take questions from you, the audience. So please type any you have in the Q&A function, which should be a little button at the bottom of your screen. Well, that's more than enough from me. So without further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Professor David Nutt and Will Self. Gentlemen, over to you.
Good evening, everybody out there in the virtual space. The definition of a virtual object is something that doesn't have a material existence, but which is commonly perceived. So join us in feeling the contours of this unusual virtual object for the next hour and 10 minutes. And I can't think of a more engaging and frankly important interlocutor than David Nutt to have this evening. I was saying before we came on air to David that he'd been there really at every twist and turn of the right, and I think twist and turn he'd agree with, because he's had the courage to change his views on things quite radically. But he's been there at every twist and turn of the kind of route that this country and other countries have taken in their relationship, not just with illegal drugs or things we think of as intoxicants more generally, but also with the plethora of neuropharmacological compounds that are used in psychiatry and medicine as well. So, you know, he is Mr. Drug in this sense. He's even contemplated launching his own intoxicant compound, a kind of substitute for alcohol. He and I last spoke when he was advocating the licensing of a drug called esketamine, which is a new antidepressant based on the recreational drug ketamine. And I guess I wanted to kick off this evening, David, by talking about this wavering line, as it were, between what some people would like to think of as highly scientific neuropharmacology and other people would think of as recreational drugs. I mean, how on earth can these two provinces be joined together into one territory? Is it only our social perception and cultural prejudice that divides them at all?
Well, yeah, I think I would add to that. It's a kind of political expediency. I mean, ketamine is a rather special example, but I mean, the more general case is other psychedelics. You know, invented in the 40s, really not LSD anyway, widely used by researchers, widely used recreationally, lots of interest in terms of the neuroscience, the consciousness changing, and also in terms of the therapeutic value. And then, because of the Vietnam War and the government, the American government getting worried that acid was making people vote against the war, the drugs then became vilified and banned. And that then has led to 50 years of censorship where there's been no progress at all in terms of the medical use, very little impact of the ban on recreational use, but completely stymied research. And now it's coming back. And one of the reasons it's coming back is it's not just our research, but also the fact that a lot of young people are using drugs like psilocybin and ayahuasca for benefit. I don't like to call them recreational drugs because I don't think most people are using them for fun. They're actually using them to get more insights into themselves and into the meaning of life, etc. So the 60s is kind of resurrecting, and that is giving us ideas about how we can use them in disorders such as depression and OCD.
You did work on SSRIs in the past. You used selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which are the most widely used class of antidepressants now. Is there a sense in which this new research that you've been involved in, and you're involved with a new unit at Imperial on this, and you've also been working with the Beckley Foundation, famously set up by Amanda Feilding, who was sort of wild child of the 60s. Just as you, David, gained your notoriety for equating the harms of horse riding and ecstasy, Amanda Feilding's known in the circles that I've sometimes moved in as hole in the head Feilding, because she trepanned herself with a hand drill. So again, you know, you wouldn't, this is a somewhat unlikely pairing, but long question and a lot of detail. But I wanted to observe that this idea that you know, is it a bit comparable to the problem that we've had with antibiotics? Do you think that the drugs really aren't working anymore, the antidepressant drugs, the SSRIs, and that's why we need to look for more antidepressant compounds?
Yeah, I mean, the SSRIs were an advance in terms of, over the old tricyclics, amitriptyline, imipramine, in terms of safety. They weren't an advance in terms of efficacy, and we've known for 50 years that the antidepressants get about 50% of people well. And the other 50%, some get a bit better and some don't get well at all. And that's why we have been desperately looking for alternatives. And in fact, it's proved so difficult that the big pharma has just given up. You know, senior vice presidents of big pharma, GSK, sorry, said, well, anyone that works in the brain space needs a head read. You know, the companies have given up on it. And that's why going back to something like magic mushrooms is very important, because without us doing that, I don't think there will be innovation.
I mean, the tricyclic antidepressants, as you say, had considerable harms attached to them. I remember being on them, I have to say, and they had considerable side effects as well that you don't get with SSRIs.
That's right.
But it slightly reminds me of the incredible faddism you particularly see in psychiatry, and in a way, arguably more than you do in other fields of medicine. I mean, there has been, throughout the 20th century, you think of the way in which barbiturates, for example, were used initially as sedatives and implicitly as a mental health drug. Then moving on to the benzodiazepines, which I believe you did some really groundbreaking pharmacological work on yourself as part of your doctoral work.
That's right.
And then we have another fad, don't we? We say goodbye to the benzos. They look addictive. On with the tricyclics. Too many people having problems, heart attacks with those. On to the SSRIs. What's going on, sir?
Well, I think it reflects, Will, the fact that the brain is a very complicated thing. You know, and that's why I'm a psychiatrist. You know, I mean, when you're a junior doctor or a medical student, you know, you work in all the different organ systems. You know, you spend 6 weeks being a heart doctor and 6 weeks being a kidney doctor. At the end of that, you've actually worked it out. You know, it's pretty much everything you need to know you can learn in 6 weeks. And then you go to psychiatry and you realize in a lifetime, you will never solve the problem of the brain. It's just, the brain is just such a much more complicated organ. And there are 80 different neurotransmitters in the brain, and each of those has some role, and perturbing them could lead to problems, and targeting them could lead to treatment. So it's just that it's a much, much bigger challenge than any of the other organ systems.
But you came out with that stat on SSRIs of 50%. And I think a lot of people listening to this or watching us might be a little shocked by that. These are the most commonly prescribed, you know, what's called anxiolytic drugs in the pharmacopoeia, aren't they? And they still have an image of almost kind of, you know, Arthur C. Clarke said any technology that's genuinely innovative has the character of magic. And ever since Prozac appeared in a widespread way in the late 80s, it's been viewed magically, hasn't it? So, you know, if you went to the shaman back with the ayahuasca and he said, well, 50% of the time you'll meet God and resolve your most primal issues, and 50% of the time you'll just throw up and have a really bad trip, you wouldn't consider that a particularly good deal, would you?
No, and of course, that's the real question is how much better are psychedelics than the traditional drugs? The first thing we can say is that we don't yet know, because people haven't done head-to-heads. But I think when they do, certainly for some forms of depression, I'm pretty sure that psychedelics like psilocybin, magic mushroom juice, will turn out to be better, not only in terms of the speed of onset, because the effect is almost immediate, whereas the SSRIs take 6 to 10 weeks to work, but also I think in terms of the quality of the response, and also I think that because you only take them once, you don't have the side effects. The problem with SSRIs, you take them every day, so you're changing your serotonin system every day. Whereas with psilocybin, it's a trip or maybe 2 trips over 6 weeks or so, and your brain is kind of reset, and it allows you to resolve your depression in a very different way. And in fact, that's what our research tells us now. We now got fairly good evidence from brain imaging studies that what SSRIs do is dampen down the deep fear centers in the brain, and they kind of protect you from stress. And the reason they take 6 weeks to work is it takes 6 weeks for the brain to heal from the stressors it's been under. Whereas psychedelics work on a high cortical level, and they reframe your way of thinking. And a lot of depression is due to negative thinking, and people get locked into maladaptive and pointless thought processes about guilt and failure, which you can disrupt in a trip, and then people can reset themselves and start thinking normally again.
But you're a complex thinker, and as you say, the brain neuroplasticity, or the brain mind, no matter how you want to conceptualize it, is fantastically complex. It's no wonder that we get in a tangle about what the world is, since we're approaching it with something that's almost as confusing as the world we see. But we can't just read either from statistics or from brain images what's going on in this highly reciprocal interaction, can we? And you would accept that social and cultural factors are strongly implicated in the way that all sorts of drugs affect us.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the more remarkable things we've discovered in our ongoing research is that we have the problem when we're doing psychedelic research, we have the problem of what's a placebo. And people say, well, you can never blind a psychedelic, because a psychedelic experience is so profound that people know they've had it or not. Well, in fact, we discovered that if you put people into exactly the same situation as they would be in if we were giving them a psychedelic experience, and you give them a very low dose, a non-psychedelic dose of the same drug, some of them do have a kind of psychedelic experience. And that you can go back then to the 60s. There are experiments done. If you're in a room and everyone's having an LSD trip, you can have an LSD trip, even though it's not quite the same as what they're having. It feels to you real.
But one of the notable things, surely, so for example, with Prozac, is that Eli Lilly's shareholders have made a vast amount of money out of a drug that has 50% efficacy, according to you, in any given case.
Yeah. Well, but it's because it was safer. And I think
but hang on a minute, David. If you said to me, half our showers will just piss all over your bathroom floor and the other half will go in, but you've got to pay for all of them, I'd think that you were a shower company I didn't want to do business with.
Well, all I can say is that the progress has not been great, but safety has been the driver, and those people who do well on SSRIs, and who usually the ones who don't have side effects, they can maintain wellness for a long period of time.
Do you not think there might be a sort of strange phenomenon of kind of morphic resonance or collective response? I know there was some research on caffeine recently that really suggested that only 10% of people get a distinct psychoactive effect from caffeine, from coffee, where they are really stimulated. All the rest of us are just picking up on their buzz. They're the ones who are really flocking into all of the chain coffee stores and buying. And the rest of us think, oh, I'll give that a try. And we're almost jizzed up by the fact of joining the coffee run.
Yeah, the caffeine research is quite fascinating, isn't it? That's right. Placebo caffeine, well, decaffeinated caffeine, gives many people the same buzz as real caffeine. I mean, at low doses, if you were to take 6 jugs of it, and then real caffeine, you then start to get jittery. But at the levels we take it, there's strong placebo effect in what we drink. Right,
but and do you not think also that say with the SSRIs and with psychiatric medication in general, given back to that 50% figure, there's got to be a good large effect due to the fact that you're being given a drug by your doctor or a psychiatrist who's talked to you seriously, is highly qualified, knows the risks, and is giving you a medication that they believe may work for you. Yeah, that's a very important factor, isn't it?
So, well, yes, and we can disassemble that. I mean, there are two aspects to that. The first is most doctors don't do a lot of psychotherapy as well, and so that if they did, the effect of the actual SSRIs would be stronger, I think. So what you're looking at is probably the worst case in the way they're currently used without much intervention by therapists. But also, of course, we got the placebo comparisons, and the placebo comparisons, and not just for psychiatry, but for most of medicine, placebo is about half as good as the licensed treatment. And that's because of all the things you pointed out. You know, people want to get better, they're being looked after, they're being taken seriously, they believe in the medicine, etc.
There seems to me, though, a distinction between, as it were, uses of mood-altering compounds, either psychiatrically or, if we think of, you might adopt the term noistically, from T.S. Chardin to, the drugs that, in a sense, address what you're talking about is this deep level alteration, almost in the kind of ability to propagate different schemas and ways of viewing the world.
Exactly.
That's implicated in the major hallucinogenics as opposed to antidepressants. And you might say that all of these things, if you like, the who gives them to you and the extent to which you're autonomous, or whether you believe or put faith in the compound because of somebody else's technical knowledge, all of these affect the thing. So why should we in particular look to doctors and psychiatrists for these drugs rather than a shaman? Say a shaman now. Why wouldn't we go to a shaman?
Well, actually, people are, because there aren't any doctors doing it.
Yeah.
In fact, that is one of the best evidence we have for the efficacy of drugs like mushrooms and ayahuasca, particularly in disorders like PTSD, is that large numbers of our military vets with PTSD and American vets are going to shamans and getting a treatment that they cannot get in the health service because these are illegal drugs. In pretty much every country in the world, psilocybin's illegal, and most countries, ayahuasca is illegal. So people are doing that. Now the question is, and it works, isn't it? Absolutely. We get these wonderful narratives of soldiers who've been burdened by the memory of their dead companions for years, and then they can be released under an ayahuasca or a psilocybin trip. There's no question they work, but so why are we denying it to people who can't afford to go to Holland or to South America to have these treatments? And that is because of this kind of myth that these are dangerous drugs and that these are drugs which are going to change the world so that people, won't ever take responsibility anymore. And it's completely, it's been a lie for 50 years, and we've got to puncture that.
But a lot of critics of Big Pharma would say that the demonization of these compounds is a function of essentially what the founding father of sociology, Weber, called professional closure. Going back to thinkers like Thomas Szasz, lately discredited by his association with Scientology, but really the author of quite reasoned critiques of what he called the therapeutic state in the late 60s and early 70s, where he saw a kind of lockstep between pharmacological companies and medical professionals, where frankly medical professionals really needed drugs and needed the control of drugs to be in their hands in order to give themselves professional status and make their money. Do you think there's anything?
Of course, there's truth in that. In fact, this has really come to the fore now with medical cannabis in the UK. I mean, it's going to be an issue in the next few years with psychedelics. But let's look at medical cannabis. 200 million Americans have access to medical cannabis. In Britain, it was made a medicine 2 years ago, and in 2 years, there have only been 2 prescriptions on the NHS. We know over 1 million people every day are using black market illegal cannabis to deal with problems, mostly pain and sometimes anxiety and trauma. And doctors can prescribe. They've had, for 2 years, they've been allowed to prescribe, and they are not prescribing. Why? Because I think this is too much of a challenge to the medical profession. And doctors generally don't like patients coming to them with a solution, which I think is bizarre. If a patient comes to me and said, I've sorted out my problems, can you help me understand it? I say, great. But a lot of doctors just say, no, no, unless NICE or unless the pharma companies tell me to do this, I won't do it. And we've actually, I think over the last 50 years, medicine has lost a lot of its ability to be intuitive and to be caring, because the doctors have been told just to do what you're told. You know, if the trial's got to be there, NICE have got to approve it. Outside that, you can't be a doctor, and that's why we're not getting progress, because if the pharma industry isn't making developments, doctors are not learning anything.
You talked about you mentioned PTSD now, and of course PTSD is a good example of what we think of as a mental illness that's only gradually been effectively codified. And I'm actually working on an essay on trauma and PTSD now, and I don't know if you're familiar with its history in the 19th century and with the concept of railway spine.
Absolutely.
And you know, there is something, is there not, to the argument, for example, that definitive PTSD, which seems to be characterized, and this is why it's so preoccupied psychoanalytic thinkers, by this phenomenon of afterwardness, as Freud would have called it, with this idea of the belatedness of an experience. The sufferer from PTSD always sort of says, I sort of should have seen it coming. You know, what's horrible about it is I keep reawakening to the fact that I wasn't prepared for what happened. And do you not think there's an argument, I realize this is a bit of a sidebar, but it'll lead back into drugs, for saying that, you know, what we think of as PTSD is distinctively a modern phenomenon, that it relates to technologies that create in a sense, false sense of security, but then disintegrate around us. That's why we see it first in the 19th century in relation to train accidents. At least we see the first actual accounts of it.
It codified then, but no, look, let's be honest. You know, a lot of patients I have seen with PTSD, women who have been raped, often repeatedly raped by their fathers for years, they wake up every night in a sweat 2 or 3 times a night thinking he's coming into the room, even though he's dead. You know, that has existed for all time.
I agree with you. And you know why, though, David? That's because that's the same phenomenon. The family itself is the equivalent of the railway carriage that you sit in, unthinking about the wheels beneath you.